All right, so I'm gonna get started. Hi everyone, my name's Eric and I work on the podcast training team at PRX. Welcome to the open webinar series from PRX and the Google Podcast Creator Program. So today our webinar speaker is Lindsay Abrams. Lindsay is my good friend and colleague, and she is currently the design strategist for podcast and audio at CNN. And before CNN, she was on our training team and built out PRX's design thinking and podcast training program. And we use the design, the human-centered design framework for design thinking for producing podcasts. And you'll get a glimpse into that process in Lindsay's webinar today. And this webinar today is titled How to Create a Listener-First Podcast. So this session will be an hour, starting with Lindsay's presentation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll head into a 15-minute Q&A. We'll try to do our best to get through as many questions as possible, but unfortunately, we probably won't be able to get through everyone's questions. So please bear with us. All right, well, let's get started. Lindsay, are you ready?
I'm ready, Eric.
Well, thank you for coming today, and passing it over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to everybody who's joining. For me, it's 7 a.m. And so I'm just imagining that everybody else woke up at the crack of dawn, although I know you probably didn't. But it is great to be here. My name is Lindsay Abrams. As Eric mentioned, I'm the design strategist for CNN Podcasts and Audio. That's a new team that started just about a year ago, not even. And my work on that team, design strategist sounds like a funny word. It's because it's mostly made up. But it's really all about working with product, but also with our content teams, the people making the podcasts, and helping them understand the motivations and needs of people who are coming to our site or to our app to listen to our audio, and then their actual listening needs as well. And when I work with both of these teams, I really encourage them to take an audience-first iterative approach to content creation, which means we're thinking about the listeners and we are making a lot of rapid changes very quickly using a process called design thinking. So design thinking, you may have heard of it as human-centered design, or that thing with a lot of Postit notes. It's a process. You may have seen it as kind of a list of steps that you have to follow, but really I think of it more of a mindset. It's a way of approaching work that really encourages you to be collaborative, and that keeps teams focused on solving the right problems. And what that really means is the right problems for the people you're designing for, the people you're creating something for, in this case, the listeners who are going to be listening to your podcast. It's a lot of fun in real life. As I mentioned, a lot of Post-it notes, a lot of Legos and art supplies, a lot of collaboration. It's been a tough year not being able to be in crowded rooms like this with people. Design thinking looks something more like this in 2020. This is a program I use called Miro that tries really hard to recreate that feeling. Instead of being in a room together, we'll all be in a Zoom room and we'll be making virtual sticky notes, and it does a pretty good job. It's good to know that even if we can't be together, it's still possible to adopt these techniques, although I don't think it's completely the same. So we're going to be talking about this idea of creating a listener-first podcast using the tools of design thinking. This first part is going to be a little bit theoretical, but really what it just means is listening. So before I go forward, I need to say this right away. You are not creating a podcast for everyone. You may think that you are, but I promise that you are not. And if you are making a podcast that's going to appeal to every wonderful person in the world, you are probably actually creating a podcast for nobody. So when we're thinking about listening to our listeners and talking to them, we're really thinking about that specific person who you can imagine as that target listener of your podcast, the person who it's really going to speak to, who's really going to find it useful and meaningful. You're not thinking about a broad demographic group of people. You're not thinking about an age range or a race or people living in one area. You need to get as specific as possible. And this is where audience research and talking to your listeners comes in and helps you achieve that. All right. So the goal of listening is to understand your users' lives, behaviors, and beliefs so that you can design something that will fill a need and fit into their lives. And I want to start by talking about this first part. Understand your users' lives, behaviors, and beliefs. I want you all to think to yourself, and I'm wondering if you have ever wondered why a lot of daily news podcasts, something that my team at CNN thinks about a lot, are around 26 minutes long. Think about it for a sec. There's a clue there. Yeah, they're timed to the average US commute. Now, that's not quite the case any longer. So if you're creating a daily news podcast, you suddenly have to be thinking about, all right, what is my listeners' context now? How much time do they have to sit and listen? And how much attention are they able to pay if they don't just have that sitting in traffic time? And beyond that, if you're making a daily news podcast, you also want to be thinking, like, what's the most important news that they need in a daily podcast when they wake up in the morning? Like, what do they need in order to have a successful day? What's the right time and length for them to pay close attention? If it's an investigative series, maybe they really need time where they can sit down and follow every twist and turn. A lot of people like to multitask while they're listening to podcasts. So what exactly are they doing? And how are you going to be able to create something that accompanies them without being a distraction, or that, they're only able to sit there in the dark and listen? Maybe you're creating a podcast that you want people to sit there in the dark and listen to, but that's something you have to take into account as well. So going deeper, I talked about understanding people's lives and beliefs. It's not just about creating something that's convenient, but also about creating something that's going to be meaningful. You want to think about what will sway someone to listen to a podcast who has never started yet. What will convince someone who already has that super full phone of all the different podcasts that they try to keep up with every day, that there's room to make space for a podcast like yours? When you're talking to your listeners, you want to answer those questions. And unfortunately, you can't go to them and say, hey, what's the perfect podcast I can create that you're going to listen to, right? Because unfortunately, listeners can't always tell you that. But what you can do is gather clues about them, gain some empathy for them, and start to understand them as a full person so that you can, as the person with all the editorial chops, come in and think about, okay, knowing what I know about this person, I know what's going to be meaningful for them. So that means when you're talking to your listener, like getting to those things that they tell you they care about. And really importantly, it may not be in the context of podcasts. When I talk to listeners, I want to know, what are conversations they have with friends that are meaningful? When do they need a moment to escape? What are their values? And this is where having a conversation, really getting to know someone, is going to give you an edge. All right, so you can design something that will fill a need. That's a loaded statement right there. And all the time, people I work with, people who I consult with will ask me, what do listeners want? What do they want? It's a really great question. I ask it all the time. I can't stop myself. I'm like, hey, do you want this? It takes a lot of practice to suppress that impulse. The problem is, as I said before, listeners don't know what they want, or they may not be able to articulate it in a way that's just like fully formed podcast idea. And what they want is so much less powerful than what they need. And I know it's a funny thing to say that like anyone needs a podcast, because they probably don't, but it's important to think about it in those terms. The urgency, how fulfilling it can be to find a podcast you love. And people can need a lot of things. They may need an explainer about how the election process is supposed to work in the US if things don't feel very messed up, like CNN's podcast Election 101. They may need a show that gives them even more context into how America got as polarized as it is, like WNYC's wonderful The United States of Anxiety. They may just need a podcast that tells stories that are engaging enough to keep you distracted, but not so engaging that you can't fall asleep, like Sleep With Me, which very cool format if you haven't checked it out. They may need a podcast like Tell Them I Am that makes them feel represented and talks about their community in a way which they haven't heard before. And they may just need a podcast that is 2 minutes long so that their kids can brush their teeth and stay entertained that whole time. So there are needs that can be solved by podcasts in all different dimensions. One of my favorite examples of how all of these different elements can come together and create something that fits a need and is going to be truly meaningful is a podcast called The Longest Shortest Time. It had a great, I think, almost decade-long run, and unfortunately, it's no longer in production, but it was really one of those early great storytelling podcasts that was all about parenting. And the way the podcast came about is that the original host, Hillary Frank, you see her there, and she's talked about this. She was a new mother. She was struggling a lot. I've heard it's hard to be a new parent. And she would be up in the middle of the night with her crying baby and just feeling completely alone in the world. So tired, so frustrated, and just wondering like if anybody else was even out there. And so she created this podcast, and its original tagline was a 3 a.m. bedside companion. And the idea was, I want to reach other parents who are up in the middle of the night with their children. And I'll tell you that I discovered this show like back when it started, and I loved it. I was not a parent at that time, but there was something about it that still spoke to me. I really liked gaining empathy for what parents were going through, thinking about it from the perspective of somebody's child. But there was one little thing that Hillary would do is that at the end of the episode, she would say, all right, I'll see you at 3 a.m. when the next episode drops. She actually made the episodes go live at 3 a.m. I never listened to them at 3 a.m. because I would be asleep. I would listen to them like later in the afternoon the next day when I woke up. And so that didn't matter to me because they were available podcasts or on demand. But I have to imagine that for the other parents who were the target audience of this show, who were waking up sometime around then with their children, having this podcast come into the world right then so that they could listen to it may have made them feel connected to this community and less alone. That's something truly meaningful. All right, that is a lot of theory. As I said, we can talk more about that in the Q&A, so feel free to ask questions for later. But I want to talk a little bit now about how to answer these questions, how to get to those lives, beliefs, behaviors, and then we'll talk about what to do once you've actually done that and understood your target listener. All right, so there are a lot of different ways of listening to your audience, and you may have mentioned I was talking about conversations. But there's also the classic quantitative data and metrics about your podcast. If you already have a podcast, you're familiar with these. If you don't, there's some information you can get just by looking at download data, for example, but it's not very comprehensive. And really importantly, the number of downloads you get, it's an important number. It shows where you are on the charts. It's what you tell advertisers about, but it doesn't equate to listens. And to illustrate that, just everybody look at your podcast app right now and look at the very long list of podcasts that have been downloaded to your phone that you just haven't gotten around to listening. So data can tell you some things, but they can't tell you everything about how your listeners are truly engaging with your show. And hopefully it's not enough for you that people just passively download your podcast and then don't listen to it. You want them to be active audience members, right? Another method that can span quantitative and qualitative is surveys. And I'll say I do surveys all the time for podcasts before they launch, after they launch, trying to understand listeners. I can get some of that more specific data, like when in the day do you turn on the podcast? And do you listen to it all at once, or do you listen to a little bit and come back later? Questions like that help us understand the best way to format the show. And you can also ask more qualitative questions as well about, what did you learn from this episode that you listened to? Or what do you want to hear more of? Oops, sorry about that. But at the end of the day, surveys are a little bit limited because they can only tell you what you're asking, right? You have a very specific way of framing your questions, and it's not going to get to everything you want to say. One sec, guys, sorry. I lost my notes, which I would like to have. They deleted themselves. That's so rude. Okay, I'm here. Another thing you can do is social listening, which is also known as lurking. Basically, think about that target audience, that community you want to reach, and find what hashtag they're using on Twitter, find their Facebook group, find other places where they're gathering, and just go in and read what they're talking about. Maybe engage in those conversations a little bit and try to get to know them better that way. But if you really want to take it to boss level, like best step is this idea of doing listener interviews, having one-on-one conversations with your current listeners or the listeners who you are trying to reach to understand them better. All right. These are my 7 simple steps for how to talk to your listeners. And I have these because it can be super intimidating to just go out there and talk to people. I get that. I work with journalists a lot, and for them, it can be confusing because it's different from going into an interview and the way you would prep. And it can also seem like I'm just going to go talk to one person. I don't understand what I'm going to get out of that. So I want to say the easiest way to learn how to do this and to understand why it's valuable is just to go out there and try it. And so following these steps, just giving it a shot, I promise you'll know more than you did before about your audience, and you'll be in a really strong place to start. All right, step 1, you have to decide who out of all those people out there you want to talk to. These should be people who you think are going to be your core audience, maybe the first people who are going to find out about your podcast and be really excited about it. You may, after talking about them, find out like, wow, I thought this person was in my target audience and they're not at all, but that's important information too. And I'm guessing if you already have a podcast or an idea for a podcast, something you're working on, you already have a good idea of who these people are or where they hang out. And that can be virtually or in real life. Next, you have to find these people. I want you to try really hard not to just talk to your friends or people you know. At least go to friends of friends. There are some expensive ways to get out there and find and recruit using some fancy programs that will let you screen all different people and send them gift cards, the whole shebang. There is the cheap and still very effective, I promise, way of just putting yourself out there. The classic way is to do an intercept, to go to a coffee shop where people are kind of hanging out, killing time, just sitting down and saying, hey, can I talk to you for a little bit? Unfortunately, that's tricky to do right now, but there are plenty of ways to do a virtual version of that, right? Kind of going to where people are hanging out online and asking to have a conversation. I do a lot of social media call outs like, hey, I want to talk to you. And I'll offer a little like reward for their time. But I gotta say, if that's not in your budget, it's usually okay. People really love to talk about themselves. And so you're like, hey, can I just spend some time with you and you tell me all about yourself and you don't have to listen to me at all? Like a lot of people are gonna be into that. All right, step 3, you need to make a guide. Key topics that you want to address and areas you want to hit. You can list specific questions, but notice that I call this a guide, not a script. You want to allow some space for this to feel like a real conversation. I also encourage you to invite teammates or collaborators to join you in the interview. So I say it's a one-on-one conversation, but you may have some people behind you or kind of silent on Zoom if you're doing a video chat. And the reason why you want this is that having extra people, they're going to notice things that you won't, because you're trying to get a really deep understanding of this person, not just taking notes of what they say. And so I find it's helpful to make a guide for the people who are going to be listening and taking notes as well, letting them know like what kind of information will be most useful to me. So I tell them like, please collect facts about this person, direct quotes that feel powerful, and also feel free to write down some insights that you're gaining, things that they can infer based on what the person you're talking to is saying, or just questions or ideas that the conversation sparks for them. Like, hey, I noticed they said this. I wonder if that means that. Those things are often more important than the direct observations that you make. All right, step 4, you have that conversation. Some general rules of thumb: approach people with curiosity. Worry less about sticking to your guide and more about following their interests. Don't be afraid to engage with them and make it a little bit of a two-way conversation, but try really hard not to insert your opinions or jump in with answers when they're like trying to remember something on the tip of their tongue. Like give them a moment to figure it out for themselves. That's a very telling moment. You also can poke at inconsistencies. If somebody says one thing and you're hearing them say something else later, it's okay to kind of not call them out, but very gently from that place of being curious, just be like, hey, I noticed you said one thing, but now you're talking about it this way. Like, can you explain for me a little more, like what you mean by that? Really important, you're not a journalist in this context, right? So you're not after a single truth. You're not after a gotcha moment. You're trying to gain empathy for the person you're talking to. So it's okay to make a leap of logic, to make assumptions based on your interpretation of what's happening. I find it's really helpful in real time. If something occurs to me, I'll just summarize some of the inferences I'm making and recite them back. So, what I'm hearing is that you attend webinars first thing in the morning because you wake up feeling really inspired and ready to take on the world and feeling like you can do anything. And then it sounds like maybe the reason why you binge Netflix later in the afternoon is because like a lot of that's just been beaten out of you by the day. And that person may jump back in and say, yes, that's exactly it. Or they'll say, well, not exactly, and they'll explain further, and that'll help you understand better. And one more tip for these conversations is pace yourself. Try not to do them all in one day or like one after the other. It's really tiring to have this kind of intense one-on-one conversation with someone. If you're an introvert like me, you may need like 2 days to just nap after it happens. All right, once you have your conversation, you go back and take some notes for yourself and you look at the notes that your teammates took and you want to compile all of them. There are lots of ways to do this. Some people like spreadsheets. Some people like to just highlight a transcript. I like putting everything in Postit notes and then starting to tag those Postit notes based on different categories so I can see them all laid out in front of me. And again, virtual Postit notes for now, which are kind of easier when you have this many. Once you have those, you want to really read through them, think about them, and then start to move them around and group them based on theme. So theme meaning whatever makes the most sense to you, right? Like what I'm hearing people say, what seems to go together from these different conversations. You should have had about at least 5 conversations when you get to this point. And then you want to give each of those themes a kind of headline that for you sums up what people are trying to say. And again, there's no right or wrong way to do these. I try to frame them as needs or as important things that people are telling me about themselves. Once you have your themes, you can stay there, or you can go a step further and create a clear summary that may take the form of a point of view statement about a specific person who you're going to try to design for. It can be a persona that combines kind of different conversations that you had. But really importantly, whoever you create to describe what you've learned should have really clear needs stated. And then you want to let everybody know about them, and you want to make sure that they stay front and center. So with people's permission, I take videos of our video calls and then make little compilations of clips from interviews that illustrate the personas so that I can go to people who weren't in the interviews and say, hey, look what our listeners are telling us. I make a Slack channel where I just keep talking about the personas, reminding people about them. And then every time someone has a question about our podcast or what we should do with it, I always answer in terms of what the persona would say, because my opinion is a lot less important than me being able to say, well, let's look at this person who we're creating our podcast for. Here's what I think is going to be really meaningful for them. All right, those are the 7 steps. I promise they are a lot less intimidating than they may seem. You could all go out and do this afternoon. Have a great conversation, learn a little bit more about the person who you are trying to create a useful and meaningful podcast for. And then the question is, like, why again do I even want to do this? All right. I've been thinking about empathy and having conversations with listeners as a superpower. They give you these incredible ways of working that you would not have if you were just relying on assumptions about your audience or data or anything like that. So I'm going to go through 3 of my favorite ways to use your listening superpowers. All right. Having personas, having an understanding of your listener allows you to go deeper than opinions. What I mean by that, asking whether your podcast is good or bad is the wrong question. What you're asking is whether you're meeting the need of your target listener. You want that person to think that it's good. And if you're meeting their need, they're going to think it's more than good. I'm going to keep saying this. They're going to find it meaningful and they're going to make space in their life for it. Sometimes you need to let that override your own judgment. Like I was saying, I frame things in terms of what our listeners are going to want, not what I think. And you also may need to let that override feedback that you're getting from peers or mentors who aren't in your target audience. They may be a podcasting pro who is laying all of this advice on you, and they can tell you a lot of great things about why this podcast does not work for them. But if they're not in the target audience, that shouldn't really matter because you're not making it for them. You can also use your understanding of your listener to help you make tough decisions. So if you're trying to decide like the right direction to go in, and that can be what story to cover, what angle to take, maybe even just what tone you want to set with your theme music, you can think about the listener. And remember, your listener usually can't tell you yes or no. It's not literally going to them and saying, which one do you like? But if you make your decision based on a true empathetic understanding of them and their needs, you'll have more confidence that it's a good decision. And then you can go back to the listener and say, hey, I created this thing. Is it working for you? All right, superpower, gain insights that no one else has. There's a lot of conventional wisdom about podcasting there, like that 26-minute stat I gave you earlier. And that's probably why a lot of, at least a certain kind of podcast sounds the same, right? There's the like This American Life model, there's the segmented chatcast model. Those are all really great, but when you gain new insights about your listeners, you can really push towards something that's truly original and unique and that will stand out in the marketplace. So building off these insights can give you the inspiration to try something that's new, and it can give you the confidence to be a little bit daring because you're not just throwing ideas at the walls and saying, hey, maybe this will work. You're taking that risk based on information that you've gained about your listener. And so you can have a little more confidence that you might be on the right path. This is also really important when you're talking to a network who you might want to join, or a funder who you're trying to appeal to, or an advertiser who you want to advertise on your show. You can go to them and tell them things no one else has about this specific audience that you're reaching and why this show is so meaningful, and so they'll respond to that advertiser message or help the funder reach their goal. And you'll have the evidence to back it up. And a compelling listener story about somebody who has a need and how your podcast is addressing it in a meaningful way is really good evidence. I would say it can be even more effective than a load of data that you throw at somebody. And going back to those people who aren't in your target audience, who may not get why this podcast is important, putting them in the shoes of that listener can help them understand why your show is worth paying attention to. All right. We started to talk about this, but this is kind of your fuel for brainstorms, for inspiring ideas, for trying new things. Once there's a need and a listener who you really care about, you have a problem to solve and you have a strong motivation to solve that problem. It's a lot easier to try to solve a problem than just to come up with ideas in a vacuum. And I'll say also, making a podcast you care about is really, really hard work, right? Week after week or season after season, you have to keep doing it. Sometimes you can kind of lose the rewards of doing so just in the work. Having a need that you're solving can be the inspiration that keeps you going. All right. I promise you these are really strong superpowers. And please ask more questions. And if you want to ask questions specifically about something you're working on, we can talk about how you can use what you're learning to help you make those decisions or take next steps. I do want to say, as amazing as these superpowers are, there are a lot of ways to not get the most out of what you're doing, to do it halfway, to cheat, and just end up not having these amazing powers that you thought you would. So first mistake, talking to the wrong people. Now, there's a lot of different definitions of wrong people. There's only talking to the people you know. There's talking to people who will never, ever, ever listen to your show, either because they don't get the fuss about podcasts, all they want to do is watch TV or not engage at all, or because it's just a topic or an approach that is never going to work for them. That's okay. You don't have to appeal to everybody because you're not creating a show for everybody. If you already have a podcast and you feel like you're reaching your core audience, talking to people who are so on target, who just love everything you do, it's great, can feel really good, but it's not going to offer you new insights that you can build on. You also don't want to only talk to the right people. the people who feel like, yes, these people are on target, they're going to help me, because there may be an opportunity to reach listeners beyond your target audience. So a podcast like The Longest Shortest Time, it was great that it started out super focused, 3 a.m., but it started reaching other listeners like Lindsay in her early 20s who was interested in it. This show eventually evolved and its tagline became the parenting podcast for everyone. You know how I feel about the word everyone. I don't know if I love that part, but they started to understand that there was a broader audience aside from the parents with new babies. You also want to be really careful not to confuse demographics with behaviors. When you're thinking about what's going to be meaningful, don't just think about what's going to be a meaningful podcast for all women, right? Get more specific and also think about women who are entering their professional careers or women who are dealing with the fallout from the Me Too movement, getting more specific about those behaviors. All right, this is going to contradict everything that I just said, or it will sound like it did, but don't prioritize your listener over everything. Your listener is really important. They should come first, but they are not everything. So a question I get all the time is, like, this all sounds great, but it also sounds like I'm going to have to do everything my listener tells me to do. And then what's the point? I've lost creative control of my podcast. It's not what I wanted to make. That is not what I'm telling you to do. You are the person with the editorial chops, with the vision, with the idea for your podcast, and who's going to bring it to life. Your listener can't do that for you. And you don't want to ignore that. You also don't want to ignore all of the knowledge you have about the industry, about the space that you're working in, about what's a podcast that's already been done and where there's space for something new and original. So make sure that that other knowledge is coming in as well. All right. Don't just go for the love. It is really great to hear that people want what you're selling. And it also feels really good to tell people like, oh yeah, I really love your project, right? Good vibes all around. And like, think about that. People want to be agreeable. They want to be encouraging. It doesn't mean that when it comes down to it, they'll become active listeners. I hear this all the time. When I'm a little further in my conversations and telling people about an idea, they'll be like, oh yeah, I would definitely listen to that. That sounds great. And I always treat that with a lot of suspicion. Like, will you really? It's a little less clear. And that's why asking those kind of black and white questions is not always very helpful. You need to be open to hearing what people are not saying, and you need to kind of have a tough skin and consider that you may need a change of plan. And this is important because you can get to the answer in a kind of market research validation sense, right? Does this work? Yes or no? The better question to ask is, tell me more, right? Not just making enough people happy enough that they may listen, but creating something so useful and meaningful to the person we created it for that they don't just like tune in, they become its biggest fan, its biggest promoter. All right. This is super important. I'm telling you all to try it once, but then I want you to go and do it again and again and again, because not only will you get a lot better at it, you're going to learn more things every time. Talking to your listeners should be a continual exercise before, during, and even after the life of your podcast. So I can give you an example. CNN recently launched a podcast that is all about politics. And the idea that we started is we were talking to listeners and they told us that, you know, I follow the headlines. I know what's going on basically day to day with the upcoming election and with politics. But what I really want is more context. They kept talking about this word context, going deeper. And so we decided to launch a podcast that comes out at the end of the week that talks about the week's biggest political story, not following like all the ins and outs, following the horse race of the election, but taking a step back and giving some context to how we got here and what we need to understand about this story. So we came up with this idea. We did some really quick prototyping. We created a logo, not this one that was just a PowerPoint file. We created a trailer in just a few hours. We created some fake segments of the show. We used real reporters, but they weren't something we would put in a real podcast because, again, they were done in a day. And then we got listeners on the phone. This was kind of a next step. And we played the trailer for them. We showed them our logo, and we got a lot of feedback about whether it was hitting or not. And we learned that our first hypothesis was pretty correct. People did want that context. They got excited when they saw our description. But once they started listening to what we created, it wasn't quite hitting the mark for them. So we knew that we were on the right path, but that we still had a lot to develop. The next thing the team did was go away and spend a week and create a more full pilot. And then we sent that out, and we had about 100 people listen to it and give us feedback. And we learned that we were getting closer. People still liked the context. They still weren't getting the right amount of context. There were still some things that weren't working. All right, we went back, we created another podcast, gave it to a different 100 people to listen to. Now, these are people who were selected to be like around who we imagined to be our target listeners. They weren't the same people each time. And really importantly, this all happened before we launched our podcast. After that second podcast, we had gotten close enough that we felt confident doing a soft launch. So we launched the podcast, and even though it's already out there, every week we are doing a retro where we're talking about what worked, what didn't. We're doing surveying so we can get more detail from listeners about what's working. And I would say after the election, we'll probably have a time when we come together and talk to listeners again to find out how their needs have changed, given how our country may or may not change after the election. And then when I said after the life of a podcast, even once something is done, you may want to talk about what worked, what didn't, talk to listeners about what they liked about it, what they were missing, so that next time you launch something, you have a good understanding. All right, finally, a nod to my very hardworking friends on the marketing side. Understanding your listener, having a POV or a persona is very powerful, but at the end of the day, it's a design tool. It's what you're using internally to help you create something that's going to be meaningful, but it is not the same as a marketing strategy. Just because you create it and it's exactly what your listeners need doesn't mean they're going to come. You have to tell them about it. Maybe you're whispering in their ear, maybe you are plastering ads all over Facebook, whatever you're able to do. Luckily, a top way people find out about podcasts is word of mouth. And so if you are deeply useful and meaningful to your listeners, those listeners may become your biggest promoters and help you, but still market your podcast. It's important. All right. And with that, I would love to take questions.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. Can you hear me okay?
I'm gonna drink some water. Yes.
Cool. Thank you. That was great. Thank you. So we have some questions. I guess I'll start with one. That'll be a good first question to ask you. Why can I, for these interviews, you mentioned that it's better not to talk with friends, or like, kind of like not people you're familiar with. Why can I talk to friends?
Oh, well, you should talk to your friends all the time. It's really important. I think whenever you go into a conversation like this, it's also a problem when like you feel like you know somebody, you want to kind of check those assumptions at the door. And that's really hard to do with somebody who you already know really well or think you know really well. It can be a lot harder to poke at those things that they are saying or come in with that truly open mind when you've already formed a lot of assumptions about this person. You think you understand them. And usually your friends, they're people who feel the same way you do about a lot of things, or you're used to having a conversation. It can be really powerful to talk to somebody who's completely new to you because they're going to tell you things that you've never heard before. And they can really open up your minds to new ways of thinking about your listeners. If you want to practice with a friend first, that I totally encourage. I do that all the time. Before I go out with a new guide for an interview I'm trying to do, I'll get someone I trust on the phone just so we can go through the pacing and make sure I feel like I'm getting the answers that I want. But then, and it's hard. I always have to push myself to do this every time. It's uncomfortable, but once I get into the group of a conversation, it's great. And what really ends up happening is you kind of make new friends after. Like I can tell you every single person who I've had like a good listener interview with, because you get to know them in a deep way and you really get to care about them once you go back and start thinking about what they told you.
Thank you. All right, here's another question. Can you share an example from a time that listener feedback led to some type of change in a podcast's content or form?
Yeah. All the time, right? All the time we're hearing those things. When I explained like with the politics podcast, right? We kept kind of changing the form and how we were structuring it, how many segments would be in the podcast, how long the hosts would talk to each other based on what we were hearing from listeners. And that wasn't just like, oh, they're talking too long, but we'd ask questions about like, where did you feel yourself not paying as much attention? Or where did you feel yourself losing interest? Things like that that can really help us structure what we're doing.
Cool. And here's another question. How can I get my target audience to engage? I'm in Nigeria and there's little or no interest in podcasting. So for non-podcast listeners, how to get in?
That's a really tough question. And I think the first thing you need to ask yourself is, are people not listening to podcasts because they're just really not interesting and it's not going to take off here? Or are they not listening to podcasts just because they don't know about them yet? So I had a wonderful conversation with a potential listener the other week, and we talked to her because she was someone who watched CNN on TV. A lot of times we think about whether our TV audience is going to want to listen to podcasts. There's a chance they might not, because like TV talking heads is a lot different from the intimacy of a podcast. But she was telling me about how she was trying to get into podcasts and she just like didn't quite get it. She hadn't found the right thing. And the more I talked to her, the more I realized that just like no one had explained to her like how to get into podcasts. She was using her smart speaker. She would hear about a podcast someone told her about, and she would just ask her smart speaker to play it for her. And she described it to me as shouting into the void. So what I realized is that she would just say, hey, play this podcast, but she wasn't able to see what the episode was called, what was going to happen. She had no idea how long it was going to be. And she said to me, she was just like, I really feel like I've missed the boat on this. Like this is some like crazy cool technology that I don't understand. And then she said, I said, you know, like, what if you thought about it just as radio on demand? And that for her, like totally changed her perspective, made it feel more accessible, made it feel like it's not some, like how I feel about TikTok, basically, some crazy obscure thing that I'm never going to understand the language of. And that actually there could be something out there that was for her. So you need to have conversations with some people who you think are in your target audience and find out like which of the two is it? Are they just not going to be podcast listeners, or have they just not been introduced yet? And if it's the second, then your strategy becomes, how do I introduce people to podcasting and get them excited about it?
Thanks. And I guess a related question is, if you're interviewing someone who hasn't been exposed to podcasts, how would you deal with that sort of interview?
Yeah, so a really important thing is when you're having these conversations, you're not just asking people about podcasts. Okay, tell me what podcast you like, what podcast you don't like, what hosts you like. Again, you're trying to get to those deeper things. So you can ask them about like what makes a meaningful conversation with friends. If they love TV, you can be like, tell me about like how you connect with a host on TV and what's important to you there when it comes to trust. You can say a question I love is like, tell me about a conversation you had that caused you to change your mind about something. And then I think about like, how can we replicate that in a podcast? So you can have an entire conversation with someone that doesn't mention podcast once. That's actually probably going to be a lot more powerful than just going through a list of all the podcasts they like and don't like. So do not let that stop you.
Cool. So the next question is, how do you strike, and so we get this question a lot related to design thinking and user-centered design. How do you strike a balance between user preferences and my interest areas without being overwhelmed with opinions and information?
Yeah, you're going to have a lot of information. It can feel really overwhelming, especially at that first point when you have all of those notes from listeners. I think you want to create the podcast that you care about. And part of that comes to talking to the right listeners, right? I could have a lot of conversations with, I'm just going to do like extreme example, like white supremacists, and I'm going to find out that they really need a certain kind of podcast. I am not going to make that podcast because it's not what I want to create, and they are not my target listener. And so you want to find your target listener who is the person who is representing that idea that you really care about, right? And what you want to do is allow what you're learning about them to kind of prod you in different directions that you may not have thought about. But anytime what you're creating doesn't feel true to yourself or to your vision, it's okay to take a step back and say, maybe I'm not understanding my listener completely. Maybe I need to go back. And also to take a step back and say, maybe this isn't my listener. But I think having those extra voices in there keeps you from creating a podcast that is only for yourself and that is meeting all of your needs and is super useful and meaningful to you, but not to anybody else. That can be a great project just to do for yourself. Lots of people do it, but if you want to reach an audience and engage with others, you do need to bring them into consideration.
Thank you. And so related, so if you were able to get to interview someone who is a listener, it's like this person asked about how you would engage with them because it's so hard to get listener feedback. And how do you get them to tell you what worked and what didn't?
Yeah, I think the problem is you don't want to focus it just on what worked and what didn't, because a lot of times people may not be able to articulate that to you in quite the way that you're looking for. And so you're kind of asking around those questions. So if you're doing a survey, I do ask like, hey, do you like this or not? But then I also ask, would you listen to another episode? And I also ask, would you recommend this podcast to friends? And sometimes the answer to those three aren't the same. And that can give you a lot of insights into something. So I've heard from people who really like a podcast, they want to listen to more, but they're not going to recommend it to friends because it feels a little too political. And that's telling me something that like, oh, this may not be what we were trying to do. We were trying to make a very straight fact-based podcast. If people feel like they can't share that with their friends and family, that's something we need to pay attention to. And if you're having a conversation with a one-on-one conversation with someone who's already listening, again, you might not get the feedback that you want because they listened to your podcast and they were excited enough to want to talk to you about it. What I try to focus there is I'm like, okay, I'm going to take it for granted that most of this is working for them. I'm going to use this opportunity to learn more about why it's working for them. So when they're listening, what they get out of it, when they turn to this podcast, who they share it with, what it means to them. And then I can use those insights to try to continue to serve that listener.
Thank you. Here's another question related to balancing different listeners. So how do you balance maintaining your core audience while appealing to your growing audience? For example, my core listeners are from Uganda, but the podcast audience is growing to include people from Canada and the US.
That's a really great question. I'm going to argue that there is a point where you're expanding, you're becoming the parenting podcast for everybody, and maybe you start introducing some stories from a kid's perspective, something like that. For the most part, I would encourage you to really stay focused on your target audience. And the reason why is because just focusing on one audience doesn't mean that you're excluding everybody else. It just means that you're creating something that's authentic and that's specific. And a lot of times people are drawn to that because it leads to really good conversations or really good storytelling. And so if the parenting podcast had originally, strayed from its mission and tried to welcome everyone in and been like, let's talk to 20 somethings in New York now, I may not have been as attracted to it as I was. So if you're discovering this because you have a podcast with a core audience and now there are people from different places coming in, it would be great to talk to them and find out what they like about the podcast, what's working for them. But it may be that they already are feeling welcomed into it and served, and you don't need to change the podcast to accommodate them.
Cool. Here's another question. So related to
questions. It's great.
Thank you. So related to the target listener. So if I like multiple people, can I combine aspects of them for my target listener?
You can. So that's when creating a persona comes in. If you've talked to, and you want to talk to a bunch of people, but if you're seeing patterns come in from a bunch of people, I usually say it's a pattern if you've heard it from 3 people, or if it's really strong opinions from 2 people. Sometimes you can have a super strong opinion from 1 person, but then you just end up being a little too narrow and serving that one person's needs and they don't apply to others. I think the really important thing to do is if you're creating a persona, don't lose that specificity, right? Don't start getting into generalizations to try to encompass everything about those 2 people. Focus on the things that are most important about their behaviors, about what's important to them. Create someone who doesn't have a face, who maybe doesn't even have a gender, other demographic information about them. Instead of giving them a name, give them a title that describes them. So I have a persona called the Facts First Curator, who's somebody who's getting their news from a lot of sources and really just wants to know what's the latest, wants the facts, no spin. And that combines things that I've heard from different people. So you can do it, just be careful about it and definitely read up on creating strong personas. There's a lot out there.
Cool. We got some more questions about the interviews. What stage would this interviewing process be good for? It seems like you're talking about podcasts that are already released? So is it like for early stage, before even starting, or even like if you have something that's ongoing, like where does
All
this
of it,
fit in?
all of it. It should be happening throughout the process. You want to start talking to people as soon as you have an idea to help you focus that idea. You want to start talking to people who are listening to your podcast to understand why. You want to talk to people once you've launched who aren't listening to your podcast yet, but you think that they should be, to learn why they haven't started yet. You want to keep having these conversations. They should be happening throughout the process.
Cool. And a follow-up to that is, do these have to be in-person interviews? So questions related to this, what you recommend for the structure. So, would listener surveys work instead of interviews? And yeah, so how will you think about structuring it?
Okay, do not conflate surveys and interviews. Surveys are great. They can get you some good information, especially as you're getting further along and want to learn about certain aspects of your podcast, kind of see like if my hypothesis about my listener is working, but you are not going to get the same insights, even if you have that open comment form and ask people to explain why, because you can't ask follow-up questions in a survey, and you're not going to get to those things that you aren't explicitly asking. Whereas in a conversation, someone can go completely off track and you can keep asking like, why? Tell me more about that, and get somewhere really deep. So surveys are a great tool. They do not replace listener interviews. And then in terms of how they should work, I think I've always believed it's important to have like in-person conversations. I'm at a time right now where I'm not having one-on-one conversations with people like out in the world, right? It's not safe to do that in a lot of places. So I do them on video chat like that. And what I actually think is nice about video chat is you can turn everything else off. You have no distractions. I can have other people listening in, and I always tell the person about that, but they can have their videos off so that they're not disturbing the conversation. I can record it and then go back and watch our conversation, because I don't take notes myself while I'm talking to somebody. I'm trying to just be fully present in the conversation. But later, it's really helpful to go back and watch it again and pick up on things that I may have missed. And so the format can change. I would recommend that you give at least 45 minutes for that conversation if it's somebody new who you're trying to understand. If it's somebody who listens to your podcast and you're just trying to learn more about why it's meaningful to them, like a half hour can be a good amount of time. But it shouldn't be a quick, just like, hey, tell me a few things. Have enough time to really build a conversation and build some like relationship between the two of you.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time, but I'll do a few more. I'm trying to see what's a good way of summarizing this. So this is similar to a question that was asked before. Can you give like a specific example of a project you've worked on where there was an instance of some feedback you got from these interviews that really changed whether it be the structure or like the content in some very significant way, something to ground as an example?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's a little tough because I can't speak in too many specifics about work that I've specifically done at CNN. But I may throw it out to Stephanie if she's okay to take it. Stephanie was my colleague at PRX, and she works with so many podcast teams at public radio stations and through the Google Podcast Creator Program. And I have a feeling she has a really good example.
Yeah, I have several actually. We teach them all the time. And so a very recent example is from an incubator that we did with public radio stations in the US called Project Catapult. And one of the shows was a public television station in Knoxville, Tennessee called Black in Appalachia. And they had come in with a lot of experience making film documentaries for television. And they thought that they would just make a podcast about Black history in Appalachia that was very documentary style. It was going to appeal to anybody who was interested in Black history or history in general. You could listen if you were a woman in your 40s, you could listen if you're a college student. And we brought them into the program because we saw a lot of potential in refining that focus. And so they did a lot of empathy interviews, and they actually found someone who was in their 20s, who was a political and like social justice organizer in Knoxville. And what he basically told them was that it really isn't that he needs to be educated about this history. A lot of people are very passionate about it. Those materials exist all over the internet. It really was about having a podcast that could create space for him to feel comfortable and proud to be Black in this region that was whitewashed for so long. And so a show that was about being very academic, all about the textbook information, that was very documentary and sound rich, all that stuff, turned into a show that was being hosted by two young women, two young Black women, commiserating over history and like trying to unpack the implications together. And so the show changed drastically. The sound, the tone, the format, the content though still stayed fundamentally the same, but the way they presented it and how they wanted to impact their listeners changed because they spoke to somebody who gave them a different way of looking at their show.
That's such a good example. Thank you for sharing that, Stephanie. And what I love about that is that's a true listener first approach, right? There's a way that we think we should do something or that we feel comfortable doing something. And there's a way that's going to resonate with the listener. And someone asked about this before, that can be a tough tension. But I think for this team, you know, realizing that they were creating something meaningful for the community they wanted to reach was more important than just doing the storytelling form they were comfortable with.
Thank you, Lindsay. And unfortunately, we're at time, though we can go on for a long time on this topic. But thank you. That was an awesome presentation. Yeah. And thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar session. We have a few more webinars lined up, so keep an eye out on our website, googlecp.prx.org, googlecp@prx.org. So that's it for today. Thank you again, Lindsay. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you all so much.